Hello and welcome to another Atypical in Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is a frontline update for February the 27th, 2023. Before we go to the Northeast sector, our first port of call, let's just have a little look at what the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, American think tank, says in their daily report. They've got a really big analysis on the problem with recruitment in Russia. They don't do much frontline analysis on a Monday because it's the weekend, it's Sunday the day before, and they don't have all of their source aggregation. But this is really worthy of thinking about because this war is all about numbers. It's a numbers game. If Russia have this infinite number of, or this hugely uh, advantageous number of people they can draw on compared to Ukraine, then Russia have this chance of winning. So people might say. But it seems from this analysis from ISW that it's a bit of a myth that they just have this, these such deep pockets to draw from in terms of personnel. So Russia likely began to run out of combat-ready forces by late May. And remember, this is their evaluation, and take this with a pinch of salt. You can disagree. It doesn't mean it's fact. Do they have an ideology? All those kind of things. Russia likely began to run out of combat-ready forces by late May 2022, forcing Russian President Vladimir Putin to decide between launching a volunteer recruitment campaign or ordering an unpopular involuntary reserve call-up. Putin likely rejected the Russian military's advice to order an involuntary reserve call-up because of the unpopularity of the move, the fact that he had not set informational conditions for it, and possibly also because of his growing distrust of the Russian MOD, which had overseen such spectacular failures in the war to date. The Kremlin had consistently outsourced voluntary recruitment efforts to support its operations abroad and during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine to ultra-nationalist groups, and likely allowed ultra-nationalist networks to expand their force generation campaigns over the summer. There's the idea that people like Wagner have been, doing the work for the Russian MOD, that kind of outsourcing of military capacity. The Kremlin likely turned to these existing networks in hopes that they would immediately attract volunteers who ideologically support his war. Putin likely ordered the Russian Ministry of Defense to form its own regional volunteer battalions to replicate the recruitment process of the ultra-nationalist groups, rather than ordering the involuntary reserve call-up of the MOD likely recommended. So we have seen rumors that the Russian regular army has been recruiting prisons in the prison sector, just like Wagner. And in fact, we've seen Wagner being pushed to the side recently in Bakhmut. And in the information space, the state TV channels have not been allowed to use the name Wagner and to talk about the successes of Wagner in, say, Bakhmut, being sort of phased out, it seems. The Russian MOD has historically struggled to generate volunteer forces and has instead remained reliant on conscription. The Russian MOD, in fact, appears to have abandoned the effort to recruit into the BARS system. This is a reserve system they have, delegating that undertaking to the ultra nationalist community. Um, and Putin has likely recognized that the involuntary reserve call up could not close a gap between Russian force requirements and available manpower in a timely fashion, however, and so gave the Wagner Group room to expand its recruitment of prisoners and its operations on the front line until the mobilized personnel could arrive en masse. And once the bulk of the 300,000 mobilized reservists had arrived with units in Ukraine, Putin began allowing the Russian MOD to reassert its primacy over all Russian forces. So this is what I was saying, that you've got this move to phasing out Wagner once some mobilized troops have hit the front line. The problem is those mobilized troops have been attrited to some significant degree. There is just a very great need still for a huge number of troops to support efforts all across the front line for the Russians. And they have to decide, but they haven't at the moment seemed to have put in place a mass mobilization effort. There are rumors that they've kept up the mobilization process. They've kept it going even after they said, it's finished. They've still been mobilizing people continuously over the last months, but they are going to reach this point, or they probably have reached this point where they need those people. They still need the people. Putin's clear efforts, it continues, to prepare the Russian people for a protracted and painful war suggests that he has realized that only the Russian MOD can actually sustain the large mechanized forces he needs to have any hope of achieving the ambitions in Ukraine. Putin may find himself facing another dilemma after another wave or two of reserve call-ups, as the pool of reservists appropriate for frontline fighting is finite. So there are only so many people who have got experience of fighting in the armed forces previously, and getting them calling up those reserves is not, it's not an infinite thing that you can do. Uh, so actually, it's worth having a look at some of these numbers. The Russian conscription system generates roughly 260,000 new soldiers each year, drawn in two semi-annual call-ups. The combination of the pre-war reserve call-up, the recruitment efforts that drew partly on reservists, and a partial reserve call-up of September have likely made significant inroads into the available reserve manpower in the age groups and with the experience appropriate to replace losses in frontline combat units. Putin may need to consider expanding conscript service itself, drawing a higher proportion of young Russian men against their will into military service each year. But demographics do not favor such an approach. Roughly 800,000 young men turn 18 each year in Russia. Expanding conscription much beyond the 260,000 of those already forced into military service risks not only taking young men with physical conditions unsuitable for war, but also beginning to pull too many young men out of the Russian economy, which Putin is simultaneously attempting to put on a war footing. Now, this is something I talked about before. You've also got people who have left Russia, not possibly like 1 million, predominantly men, have left Russia to escape mobilization. So the economy is going to suffer if you keep, you know, eating into it to fill your front lines full of troops. And it concludes: the specter of limitless Russian manpower is a myth. Putin has already been forced to make difficult and suboptimal choices to offset the terrible losses his war has inflicted on the Russian military. And he will face similarly difficult choices in 2023 if he persists in his determination to use military force to impose his will on Ukraine in the West. Russia can mobilize more manpower, and Putin will likely do so rather than give up. But the costs to Putin and Russia of the measures he will likely need to take at this point will begin to mount rapidly. Uh, I intuitively agree with this. I mean, you can't just keep drafting in more and more humans and expect it not to have an effect on your economy, on your culture, on public dissent or public opinion about the war, and indeed the government. This is problematic, and at the moment, all the front lines appear to suggest that this attritional war is eating up troops that are thrown in. And if Russia continue to try and execute a war that is predicated upon like Pyrrhic victories, where they're winning territory by throwing more men at the problem than the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians are to some degree happy to allow places like Bakhmut to be taken if the cost is so high that Russia will have to throw more and more increasingly large numbers of people at the war, to the detriment of large Russian society. So I think this is an issue for Russia, and we have seen this being an issue in terms of materiel. They can't produce this material. In one of my videos yesterday, I was talking about the fact that they're throwing BTR 50s that are from the 1950s and 60s at the front line, or at the war effort. They do not have the ability to produce more materiel, up to date material. So they're getting in stuff that is way beyond its sell by date, and that is an indication of the problems they are in. Well, that's the same for the human personnel situation as well. Okay, let's get finally to the front line. Sorry for my delay there, but I think that is really useful to talk about. Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna front line. We're going to that northeast sector. My map looks like this. Now, Andrew Perpetua says about this because there have been these pressures down to the west, or down to the south and to the west, from the Russians down south from Liman Pershi through Sinkivka, so pressure on Sinkivka, and pressure to the west towards Dvorichna across the Oskil River, with the river coming down here. This is the river, Oskil River, that you can see. And let's put that in blue so you can see it. It comes up like that, except not so zigzaggy. Anyway, that's the Oskil River. If they can, there's this salient of Ukrainian presence here, troops. The Russians will be attempting to push them across the Oskil River. So the idea that people like Andrew Perpetua now stating is that he says it's an interesting development. Russia has stopped trying to push south into Sinkivka toward Petropavlivka and indeed Kupiansk down here. And they are instead trying to push west across the Oskil River, probing for potential crossing points. So he and Andrew Perpetua said, "I'm rooting for a Bilirivka scale failed river crossing. Personally, unlikely, but I can dream." So I don't even remember, but in a place called Bilirivka, further down south, across the Severodonetsk River, there was a failed crossing where they lost 85 plus vehicles, the Russians, earlier in the war. And he's just saying, please, can that happen again? But it seems they're pushing west rather than south. Defmon says the Ukrainians repulsed an attack in the area of Mazyutivka. Russians are most likely trying to force the Ukrainians back from their salient along the river. So that's that salient I was talking about there. Other than that, not too much news. No reports. Pro-Ukrainian source says north of Kupiansk, the Ukrainians repelled an attack towards Mazyutivka from Horobivka, and in the vicinity of Svatove-Kreminna is a bit quieter. No news about Kreminna today either. The focus is on Bakhmut on both sides, clearly. And that's true. So really, when you go to Rebar, who's not posted on Twitter, but is on Telegram, talks about Kupiansk sector. Russian troops are engaged in heavy battles near Hranikivka. The Ukrainian force is putting reserves into battle, trying to keep bridges and crossings over the Oskil River under control. And then it goes down to Bakhmut. So realistically, we can sort of clear that out. Say there is fighting happening, pushing west rather than south in that area north of Kupiansk, and then we come down to uh, further down to the Svatove-Kreminna front line. Defmon says Ukrainians repulse attacks in the area of Ploshanka, Nevska, Tulska, Kreminna, Dubrova, Serebryansk Forest, Bilirivka, and Spirina. It seems the Russian have increased the pace of attacks in this area lately. So while no report says, yeah, it's very quiet, no news coming out of this entire area. No reports is saying that. Yeah, I think he's leaning quite a bit on the general staff report of the Ukrainians saying that there are repelled attacks all around these areas, as you would expect, given that that's what they've been doing for the last few weeks. But actually, no map movement. There's been no map movement from Svatova to really to Bilirivka over the last week, and this indicates that although the Russians appear to be putting on their offensive, they are getting nowhere fast, and they are finding it very difficult. There have been claims of certain counterattacks in the forest area and in Bilirivka area over the last week or so, and most of the Russian success appears to be further towards Yampolivka, Tolska, and Terny. But again, repelled attacks, and that's the same for Spirny. And then we get on to what is going on in Bakhmut and north of Bakhmut. Right, it's hard to know where to start here because there are conflicting accounts of what's going on. And it's all to do with this area just to the west of Yahidny and towards Bakivka. So we have this, and I've kept my Ukrainian line there just to show you where the advance is. This is in line with what Deep State Maps has. So towards, well, between Bakivka and Yahidny, there's been this salient that the Russians have gained this ground here. Now, actually, Syriac Maps, pro-Russian mapper, has it, and again, you've got to twist this map clockwise about 90 degrees. It's really frustrating. But this area, and there's that water course there. So if I show you, there's a water course there, or that reservoir, and to the south of it, there's this salient where the Syriac map has it larger, sort of this area here covering these two fields and a larger salient. And the theory is that or the claim is that the Russians are making quite a big advance there. They've stalled a little bit in Yahidny because this dam was bust and the Ukrainians flooded this area over here, which has slowed down advances from Yahidny. But of course, this main supply route from the west into Kromova is what I assume the Russians are heading for. To interdict that route would really make holding on to Bakhmut virtually impossible. Um, However, there are all these rumors coming out. So that were coming out last night. There are rumors of a Ukrainian counterattack in northern Bakhmut, reinforced by the message from Newsweek Polska journalist who is in Ukraine. I've checked with my source, but I'm still waiting for a response. There's no reports. I'll hold off on jumping on to conclusions till I have more info. So this thread then says, so we translate it. It says it's hot. It's a hot night in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians did not stop and launched a further attack. The counterattack went in a convergent direction at Yahidne, Bakhivka, and Pavlivka. The Ukrainians cut off the vanguard of the Russian forces from the rest of the grouping, creating a small cauldron. He then goes on to say, uh, the attack was carried out with considerable forces consisting of elements of 4 brigades. Part of the Russians advancing to the west were cut off. This is not a great offensive, but a small operational success and inflicting heavy losses on the Russians. The fighting continues. We'll see what the night and morning bring. And he does go on to, give the caveats that please refrain from hooray optimism. The Russians have thrown in new troops. Heavy fighting continues. We shouldn't be prophesying about anything right now. We are waiting to see what the morning and tomorrow will bring. And there are several versions of this. So this is quite a good visual representation of what someone here thinks is going on. Counteroffensive or counterattack, really, near Bakhmut from the Ukrainians. A risky move, but maybe worth the resources. And here we have the Ukrainian forces, including but not limited to 17th Armored Brigade and 3rd Assault Brigade, lead a counterattack with the main target appearing to be the garden shop region. Currently, the Russian attack from the north on Bakhmut not only collapsed, but the Ukrainians came to the rear of the Russian grouping. So this is what he is saying here. So that attack uh, from the Russians has brought them sort of down here. There's that water course, and we've got Suryat map saying it's this area that you Russians are in, but there are other claims that the Russians got even further to the south here, and then northwest to Berkivka and past Berkivka to this other settlement of that some people. So here I have the Suryat maps has Dubovo-Vasilivka under Russian control. Deep State map does not, so that may not be the case there. And there variously, the Russians control possibly, areas around here to differing levels depending on who you are believing. So you can see that they've made these attacks, but it's quite a thin neck here. And the claim is that the Ukrainians have done a counterattack from 2 directions, cutting them potentially or seeking to cut the Russians off here, and then isolating these troops in Bakhivka and Yahidne. But of course, it depends what troops the Russians have to bring in to counter that counterattack, and whether it's indeed true. So there are lots of claims about what's going on. You go to someone like Defmon and doesn't particularly mention it, at least not in his daily. But then, of course, his daily summary happens before the night, and it seems like that was a nighttime attack. So there's a lot of claims that the Ukrainians are using thermal imaging in the Bakhmut area because they have an advantage there, and they do quite a lot of their counterattacking at night. And as no report says here, there are rumors of a Ukrainian counterattack in northern Bakhmut. I don't have any information about that yet. To the east, the Ukrainian troops are said to have withdrawn from the eastern quarters. This I can debunk, and it's not true. The Ukrainians are definitely still there. So lots of claims and counterclaims going on. So this will be up in the Bakhivka area and the Yahidna area. Well, Suryat maps and Deep State maps have the Russians in this area, and that other Polish map that I've just shown you has them all in this area. So there are. It's a muddy information space, and trying to work out exactly what is happening is quite difficult. Rebar, the pro-Russian source, says, as a result of decisive actions, the fighters of Wagner PMC completely liberated Yahidny and Dubovo-Vasilivka. That's that small village that I said that some Russian sources are saying is under Russian control. Some Ukrainian sources denying that. The offensive is developing in the direction of Bakhivka Reservoir, aiming to reach the operational expanse in the Bodanivka area. So that's this small settlement there, where they're sort of moving towards that in order to interdict this road, or possibly interdict this road without even getting to Bodanivka. We shall see. on the northern outskirts of Bakhmut, Wagner PMC units are moving towards the Bakhmut non-ferrous metal processing plant in order to slow down the advance of the Russian forces. The enemy blew up a reservoir near Kromova, and it goes on to the east there. And just to remind you what I was reporting yesterday, that Reznikov, the defense minister, is saying that Bakhmut is really tough for the Russians. 500 soldiers a day are being killed and 900 wounded. And that is just, he would say, he would think I would imagine that that is unsustainable for the Russians. They just can't keep doing that. And this goes back to what the ISW is saying as well. So the calculation one would assume is that it is worth the Ukrainians still continuing to defend Bakhmut as much as they are, because that calculation works in Ukraine's favor. We will see what exactly is happening here. I mean, I don't really want to make any definite claims. It could be that's absolute, that it's incorrect that the Ukrainians have done that. I don't know. We shall wait and see. When it comes to the east, no reports, as you heard, said that no, Ukrainians haven't pulled out of the east, as according to some rumors. But the map looks very different for no reports here, where Ukrainians still control all of this area to the east of the river. And in fact, the Russians only seem to have sort of 3 blocks to the west of Maximenko Street. So I don't know how accurate that mapping is, to be quite honest. I mean, it seems to be fairly accepted that the Russians have really advanced quite far and up to indeed pretty much the river in one part of eastern Bakhmut. No reports does say that there is heavy fighting in these 3 particular areas. If we go on to Rebar, it says in the eastern districts of Bakhmut, Wagner PMC groups are coming close to the Bakhmutovka River, and that's obviously completely not what no reports is indicating. Russian aviation and artillery support the offensive and launch constant strikes on Ukrainian positions. Interesting, there was reports over the last few days that the Ukrainian aviation is supporting Ukrainian efforts in the northwest. So that's what's going on there. Let's try and see what's going on to the southwest. As we come on here, I've changed my mapping around quite a bit. It does appear that the Ukrainians have been pushed, the Russians have been pushed back around the southwest. They have made slight gains around this area, but it's fairly minimal. The Rebar pro-Russian source says to the southwest, Wagner PMC units continue to storm the fortified area in Ivanivska. Fighting is taking place on the outskirts of the village. The Russian forces managed to align a front line along the Bakhmut-Konstantinivka road, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat to the reserve lines. So that is to say that they are pressuring them around here. I'm not sure how reliable that is. And they say they're fighting on the outskirts. Again, I'm not really quite sure how reliable that is. We go to Defmon, pro-Ukrainian source says back south, the Ukrainians repulsed attacks in the area of Stupochki, Ivanivska, and Severny. The AFU have recaptured a few positions with counterattacks here. So if you look at the map, we have that canal coming up from the south towards Stupochki, and the Ukrainians have repulsed attacks around there, around Ivanivska, and around the southern area near the cemetery there. So yeah, that's looking slightly more positive as far as Defmon is concerned. Just a better overview around Bakhmut. I don't think the Russian forces are able to utilize heavy equipment effectively around Bakhmut, something I've been saying recently. This might be one reason for why the AFU have been able to keep fighting in Bakhmut, even if most access roads technically should be under Russian fire control. One funny thing is leopards are rumored to be active in the Bakhmut area. I'm just waiting for the Russian MOD to claim to have killed 12 in one strike. So he sources that as well. If we go on to no reports into the southern area or southwest, Russian troops did have success southwest of Bakhmut after storming the area around Ivanivska. In the area between Ivanivska and the Bakhmut cemetery, Russians managed to force a breakthrough south of the gas station on the T0504 road. Ukrainian positions are under pressure, and this is the map that he gives. So that is this area here, which is the area that I was talking about, having some slight gains there. That's as far as I understand that. If we go back there, make sure I am correct. Yeah, so Ivanivska's there. So pressure on that area with fighting around the cemetery and indeed in the southeast as well. So there is pressure from the Russians in the south, but the Ukrainians are holding out more strongly there than they are possibly up north. Although if that counterattack has happened and it is successful, that could change things quite dramatically. Okay, let's come out of Bakhmut and move further down south. If we move further down south, past Shumy, New York, and we come to this sort of northern area around Kamyanka, Krasnohorivka, and then Avdivka itself, Opitny and Vodyany to the south. Defmon says that, yeah, if you repulse attacks in the area of Krasnohorivka, so that's up the north there, Kamyanka, just coming further down south, and then Avdivka itself, and Vodyany and Novelsky. There's a tiny little bit of map adjustment I've made in Novelsky. Other than that, it seems all pretty standard stuff around there. Rebar pro-Russian source says in the suburbs of Donetsk, Somalia battalion soldiers are advancing to Avdivka from Opitny side, taking control of several fortified areas. I have no other evidence of that. Ukrainian commanders preparing to conduct a counterattack and recapture the lost positions, so they say. So that is talk that there are some gains of fortified positions. That'll be literally just small parts of fields there around Opitny. I've made a couple of adjustments around Novelska, which is this tiny settlement here. Literally, it's just like there was a bit of this tree line, hedgerow tree line that was under control of Russians. It no longer is, but they've now taken control of part of this tree line. There'll be trenches and fortifications in all of these tree lines that make this so difficult for the Russians to get past. You would think, just looking at the map, oh, the Russians could surely advance down there and take all this and encircle Pervomaisky, but they just are unable to do so. Whether this says a lot about the inability to use large amounts of mechanized equipment, you think you could punch through this area with a battalion worth of tanks and IFVs and all sorts, but it doesn't seem to be either you can't do that, or they just don't have that kind of capability or capacity of mechanized equipment. And then as we come down, so no report says there is fighting east of Pobyeda, but contrary to what Russia would have you believe, there are no breakthroughs in the town itself. In Marinka, the fighting continues at the roundabout near the northern entrance to the city, and in the center itself. Skirmishes occur south. So that's pretty much the only detail I've got at the moment. I haven't had a chance to check out too many sources, but that's to say that it appears that there will be fighting around this kind of roundabout area in the northern entrance of the city. I'm not sure of who owns this section of the town. And then there's fighting further to the south as well. And Pobyeda there's not been a breakthrough. In fact, I've changed my maps around here over the last couple of days a few times. I think there's some Russian gains in this area, just to the southeast of Pobyeda. But near Pobyeda itself, the Russians have been pushed back where they had got to the outskirts a couple of days back. And then really we come out to there and down to Vuhledar, where it appears that there's, much of the same stuff going on there. As no report says, in Vuhledar, Russian artillery bombardments continue. Russian troops failed to storm Vuhledar again in recent days, each time in the same area south of the coal mine. So the coal mine is in this area up here. So there's the coal mine there, just to the northeast of Vuhledar and to the south of that. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, the Russians did get as far as here, and indeed these dachas here. So the Russians actually had this whole area sort of under their control, or they at least advanced that far before they were eventually repelled. So no report says Russian reinforcements from Melitopol and Mariupol have arrived near Vuhledar in recent days to replenish brigades there. But if they just keep doing the same thing, then you can expect the same results. As the great maxim goes, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I don't understand what the Russians are hoping to accomplish here unless they change things up, unless they do something different. The same results will happen. So there you go. Vuhledar is producing those similar results. As for the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson, not too much information. without scouring all those hundreds of different sources myself, without ISW doing that job for me, it's difficult for me to find time to find exactly what has been happening. There are reports. I'm sure I've got this actually. Yeah. So here it is. So there are reports over the last couple of nights of quite severe shelling in and around Marnets and Nikopol, which, just to let you know, that is here. So these are quite important industrial towns sitting on the northern bank of the reservoir, and they just get hit nightly. And it basically looks like this. Over the past night, the Russians twice shelled the Nikopol district. Reports ahead of Dnipropetrovsk Regional Military Administration, so Hilisak. Russian heavy artillery hit Nikopol and Mirova territorial communities. People did survive, though. And as you can see there, that's a sort of activity that takes place. Often residential buildings seem to be hit because one would assume the targeting for shelling across here is not going to be super accurate. They're not using guided shelling. They're just basically, it appears, somewhat indiscriminately shelling the Nikopol and Marnets regions, and causing quite a lot of damage to residential houses. Other than that, that's that. So thank you very much. That's the Frontline update for the 27th of February, 2023. Please check out my Ukraine war update extra video later. I'm going to mention something. I might just mention it here. I was speaking to someone in the Navy recently, who just the other day, who has quite a lot of working knowledge of the area, and he says the only reason the Russians are supporting Syria, it's like people don't really understand this, is because it's the only Russian port access they have in the whole of the Mediterranean. So if you're talking about the Russians, right, they don't have port access anywhere around here. Like in the whole of that area, the only place they have port access is in Syria. And they were recognizing that the Western that a pro-Western government could be put in place in Syria. And if that's the case, they wouldn't have sea access. And then when you understand the importance of Crimea, the only reason they want Crimea is for sea access to the Black Sea. If they don't have either of those two things, right, you start looking at the world and you understand that Russia and you're starting to see these Baltic nations and Finland talk about, control of shipping out of the Baltic Sea. Then really it's just up towards the Arctic Circle and then over to the other side of the world. They can't access, which means getting through the Suez, not the getting through the Suez Canal from the Red Sea. All this stuff becomes really difficult if they don't have any port access in this whole part of the world. I mean, is that important? So the whole Syria thing was for them to have particularly naval port access to Syria or to the Mediterranean, and Crimea is all about naval port access to the Black Sea. Take those two out, look at how hamstrung Russia will be to operate on a global scale. Where do they have to, in order to operate all around here, they need, this is why you look at these random places that seem to be supporting Russia in the UN, and they're the odd place around Africa, and then trying to get South America on their side. It's about access to the sea, isn't it? Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. I was going to talk about it later. I've just talked about it now. Oh well, there you go. Thank you. Take care. Speak later. Bye.